I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and even I can't ignore that Spider-Man is a pretty big deal. Of all the characters made by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby under the Marvel banner, the Webhead always seems to rise to the top. Between his relatable personality, his iconic outfit, his colorful rogues gallery, and a healthy dose of nostalgia, Spider-Man has done more than a spider ever could. Best-selling comics, multiple acclaimed animated series and live-action films, prose novels, video games, and even a tokusatsu series straight from Japan. While his life may be in shambles in the comics, it's almost unthinkable to consider that he could ever be associated with failure in reality. Today, I'm going to highlight one of his failures. The Broadway play? No, Snazzy, this is something that even die-hard Spider-Man fans have forgotten about, though music is still part of the equation. It's an album entitled Spider-Man: Rock Reflections of a Superhero, the first Marvel Comics concept album released all the way back in 1976. Okay, so the backstory goes something like this. Marvel's popularity had been skyrocketing, and by the mid-70s, they were looking to expand their horizons. Marvel executive Ann Robinson, or is it Agile Ann Picardo? Well, whatever you call her, she's the one who had the idea of bringing Marvel into the world of popular music, and Spidey was the logical first choice to base an album on. She began talks with Tommy West, Terry Cashman, and Phil Kernett, the founders of a brand spanking new label called Lifesong Records, and they loved the idea. A contract was signed to release a Spider-Man record, with the understanding that if it did well, other albums would follow based on other Marvel characters. This right here could easily have been the start of a Marvel rock opera universe. And you just know it would have become part of the multiverse at some point. Probably Earth 3/4 time or something. Lifesong went all in on this project, bringing in a wide variety of songwriters and musicians to compose 12 songs for the event. The supergroup playing the music was appropriately named Hero by the label, and consisted of Joe McCree on bass, Jim Griffiths on guitars, David Sanborn on alto sax, Paul Rolnick on trumpet, Rob Stevens, Don Schloss, Terrence P. Minogue, and John Palumbo all on keyboards, Jerry Marotta, Joey D'Amico, Tom Rossiter, and Michael Clemens all on drums, and Rick Witkowski on percussions. Lead vocals were handled by Marty Nelson, though Ray DeRouge would sing lead vocals on the Dr. Octopus song, and Jenny Saxon would share lead vocal duties with Marty on Square Boy. Ah, but it's just not a Marvel adaptation without a Stan Lee cameo, is it not? That would be like filming Citizen Kane in color. It simply isn't done. So the man himself provides different narrative breaks throughout the album, either catching us up to speed on the plot or setting up the concept for the next song.
Effortlessly, he glides between the tallest buildings in mammoth New York City. What is Spider-Man really thinking?
In order to really make this feel like a comic book come to life, the album billed its band as being comprised of Earth's mightiest heroes. Just look at this lineup. Power Man on bass, Silver Surfer on keyboards, Hulk on drums, Thor on trumpet, Black Panther on guitars, Captain America on percussions, the Fantastic Four as backup singers, Conan and the Barbarians on strings, and Falcon on hand clapping. Boy, talk about undignified. Yeah, hand clapping is the job you give your little brother when your mom says you have to let him join your garage band. Also, what's Conan doing there? I thought he was a pulp character. Well, you see, Marvel had the rights to Conan back then, and his books were among their best sellers, so I guess they felt like they had to include him. I actually understand they have the rights again. Well, hopefully they're not running him into the ground like they're doing with everything else. Ultraman did all right, but this is getting a little off track. Let's take a moment to refocus ourselves. To add that last vital bit of authenticity, comic book artist John Romita was called in to illustrate the album cover. This image was inspired both by the album's title and the lyric "It's like fighting both sides of the mirror" from the third track, Peter Stays and Spider-Man Goes.
Say, can we take a moment to appreciate that art?
I mean, look at this. Most of the image is sepia-toned, making the realistic living room setting and even Peter himself look drab and depressing, while the Spider-Man in the mirror is bright, colorful, and more cartoony by contrast. There are tons of layers you can peel back with this. It can be seen as Spider-Man being Peter's fantasy that takes him away from his mundane reality, yet since Spidey still looks maudlin, we can tell it's not a total escape.
I'll bet we could do a whole video on just that album cover.
Maybe we could, but this video is about the album itself, so at some point we have to talk about the music.
Okay, how about now?
Well, if you insist. Rock Reflections of a Superhero is difficult to classify by genre in terms of music. Sure, the rock part in the title suggests rock and roll, and in a general sense you could call it pop rock, but it doesn't stick to only one sound. There's a wide range of styles here, including funk, reggae, prog, and even swing. Which style is applied depends on the mood of the song. For example, Square Boy has sort of a swing doo-wop sound to emphasize Peter's lack of coolness.
Square boy, you gotta get cool, square boy, you gotta get cool.
Dr. Octopus, meanwhile, leans a bit more psychedelic since it's framed as a nightmare sequence. And A New Point of View is just plain funky.
Swinging free from buildings tall, my trips together from wall to wall.
You know, this musical variety reminds me of the early Blue Oyster Cult albums, where there was a mix of different styles despite the fact that the band was usually just labeled as heavy metal by most critics.
Well, one thing is for sure, it is very 70s.
Like a disco ball with an afro on a tie-dye shag rug. You only need to hear a few notes to know which decade this album comes from. At the time, of course, this was the popular sound among the youth who were Marvel's target audience, so it made sense to be grounded in the then-present of musical trends. Today, it might sound a bit dated to some, but the commitment to the variety of styles helps keep it from being an artifact in the total sense. You might even call it a musical time capsule.
You did say Rock Reflections is a concept album, right? So what's the story?
Well, it covers a pretty wide swath of time from Spidey's life. It begins with a classic origin story of how Peter was bitten by a radioactive spider and gained powers as a result, then moves on to how Peter at first loves being a hero only to struggle balancing his vigilantism with his personal life. Midway through, he meets Gwen Stacy and their relationship begins, but by the end, Green Goblin puts the kibosh on that by killing her. And with his first love gone, Peter mourns as he picks himself up and moves towards an uncertain future. Now I realize that all might sound very familiar. In fact, I'm sure that some of you may have even rolled your eyes and thought, oh come on, that again? It's true that the story of Gwen Stacy is well known by this point, and some even consider it cliché to keep coming back to it. But you have to remember that this album released in 1976. Spider-Man had only debuted 14 years prior in 1962. This stuff with Gwen was all new, and all different. The hero isn't supposed to fail in saving his girlfriend, and the fact that Spider-Man did was a shock to all who read it. Ergo, it was only natural to incorporate it into the album. This was the biggest thing to happen to the character since he was bitten. And Rock Reflections conveys that story with the serious tone it deserves. Between the emotional singing of Marty Nelson and the dramatic narration of Stan Lee, this rendition of the tale turns out to be very effective. I don't know if it will move you to tears, but it will strike a chord, if you'll pardon the turn of phrase.
You know, it does sound like all the ingredients were there for a hit record. It's really too bad it flopped.
Oh, it not only flopped, it also spent the next few decades going in and out of print because nobody wanted it. Even today, the album exists on the fringe of the superhero fandom. It currently isn't even mentioned on the Spider-Man wiki, if you can believe it. I'd bet that more people remember the Spawn concept album recorded by the Iced Earth than this.
Why did it tank, though? I thought Spider-Man was popular.
Well, the liner notes on the 25th anniversary edition theorized that the label was the problem. Now, that doesn't mean Lifesong Records somehow mismanaged the production or the marketing or something. By all accounts, they did everything they could. Rather, it's suggested by Mike Ragagna, who contributed lyrics to the album at the age of 17, that it's because Lifesong was brand new at the time, and thus didn't have the same presence as other record labels did.
That was probably a factor, I agree, but I don't think it's the whole story. I also think part of this album's failure can be traced to its genre, and how that genre was viewed at the time.
These days, comic book superheroes are mainstream. They dominate in theaters, on TV and streaming, in video games, and, ironically enough, even popular music.
Nowadays, they're cool. Everybody loves superheroes, even the superheroes that nobody heard of or cared about before. Back in 1976, though, superhero comics were still considered a niche genre for children.
Teenagers who read comics were nerds who got stuffed into lockers. Adults who read comics were considered immature creeps. And females who read comics were like UFOs in that you wanted to believe they existed, but you might go your whole life without ever seeing one.
When it came to adaptations outside the comics, the genre usually wasn't taken very seriously.
The Superman movie and the Incredible Hulk TV series were still a few years away, and the Wonder Woman series was walking the fine line between serious and satire. When most people thought of superheroes in this age, they thought of something like the 60s Batman series. Campy, lighthearted, and clearly aimed at children. Side note, that doesn't mean I hate the 60s Batman, I'm just making a point. As such, something that took the genre seriously would have been a totally alien concept at the time.
Rock Reflections covers Spidey's origin story for the same reason the movies do when they get rebooted every few years. It's for the benefit of any new audience members who may not have been following the comics. And therein lies the big issue. All comic fans might listen to music, but not all music fans are likely to read comics, especially not back in 1976.
Didn't Kiss have a comic book series around this time, and one printed by Marvel, no less?
That is the case, yes, and Gene Simmons likely loved this idea, being a fanboy himself. But somebody who is a Kiss fan was likely to only buy Kiss comics, and probably wasn't going to pick up an issue of Tales to Astonish at the same time.
Ergo, I posit that Rock Reflections failed not just because Lifesong Records was new, but also because the greater public just wasn't ready for Spider-Man to enter the mainstream, and wouldn't be until 2002. The tragic irony is that today, when Spider-Man is finally at the top of his game, the album is still treated like an unwanted stepchild, outcast and forgotten by even the most devoted of fans.
If only it had been recorded in the 80s or 90s, pure nostalgia would have done wonders for it. Possibly, but as it stands now, it remains obscure. Personally, though, I think it deserves to be rediscovered.
Sure, the music is as 70s as it can be, and sure, the story is familiar to most of us these days, but this is a unique part of Spider-Man's history. It adapted the character to a medium he had never existed in before, and it did so with a level of respect that wasn't common at the time. If nothing else, at least it's not as pretentious as Turn Off the Dark.
So now that Spider-Man is the most beloved superhero in the world, maybe the time has finally come for this album to discover the audience it so desperately needs. I recommend giving it a listen and deciding for yourself if it's a worthy part of the legacy. Me? I already think it is. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.
I just have this mental image of all the MCU actors making a music video, and there's Anthony Mackie in the back, clapping his hands and trying to convince himself that he's really contributing something vital to the song. It's a very sad image, but also very funny. Is he in the movie costume or the original costume? Original, which makes it even funnier. Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon.
Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books: Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.